Welcome to the Sleepless Scholar. Tonight, we journey to the quiet places of the world, to the valleys that cup silence in their hands, and the mountain peaks that scrape against an empty sky. We are here to listen for a story that was never meant to be heard, only felt. A myth whispered not by mortals, but by the wind itself. So find your quiet place. Breathe in and out. If you feel so inclined, tell us what time it is where you are, what corner of the world you are listening from. It is a comfort to know that we are all sharing this silence together. Now, let us listen. Let us hear the tale of Lirius, the god of echoes, and the love that was born from a sound he could never truly hold. Before the Olympians carved their names into the heavens, there were older, quieter divinities. They were gods of small things, the feeling of moss underfoot, the sigh of a settling house, the shimmer of heat above a summer road. And among them was Lirius. He was not a god of music, nor of voice. His domain was the space after the sound. The reply? The repetition. He lived in the hollows of the world, in the vast stone canyons and silent caves. He was a lonely god by nature, for his very essence was a reminder of something that was already gone. He could hear the thunder, but only after it had passed. He could hear the songs of mortals, but only as they faded. He was a god of memory, cursed to never experience the present moment. He was formless, a presence in the stone and air, and he was content in his solitude. For centuries, he listened to the world's fading symphony, the roar of a lion, the crash of a wave, the cry of a newborn, and he found a quiet beauty in these ghosts of sound. Until he heard her laugh. Her name was Alara. She was a potter, a mortal woman who lived in a small village nestled at the foot of his mountain. One afternoon, while sitting by a stream, she saw a frog leap clumsily onto a lily pad, and she laughed. It was not a grand sound. It was not a song meant for the gods. It was simple, spontaneous, and utterly alive. But when it reached Lirius's canyon, the echo it created was different. Other sounds faded, growing weaker with each reply. But her laugh, it seemed to hold its warmth. It cascaded through the rocks like a stream of silver bells, and it did not want to die. For the first time in his eternal existence, Lirius felt a pang of something other than passive observance. He felt a yearning. He began to follow her. Not with eyes, for he had none, but with his entire being. He oriented his existence around the small pocket of the world where she lived, desperate for the echoes of her life. He learned her. He learned the soft, rhythmic scrape of her hands shaping clay. He learned the quiet, off-key tune she would hum while waiting for her kiln to cool. He heard the echo of her footsteps, light and hurried when she ran errands, slow and heavy when she returned from a friend's sickbed. He even learned the sound of her sorrow, a single, sharp gasp, followed by a silence so profound that its echo was a wound. He collected these sounds like a mortal might collect jewels. Each one was a piece of her, a fragment of a life he could hear but never touch. He fell in love not with the woman herself, but with the story her echoes told. It was a pure and tragic love, a devotion to a ghost. One day, he heard the echo of a new sound from her village, a man's voice, singing a gentle love song. And soon after, he heard the echo of her own voice, singing it back. He heard the echoes of celebration, of two lives joining. And in that moment, Lirius understood the true depth of his loneliness. He was merely a witness, a silent chamber that held the sounds of a life he could never be a part of. And so, he decided to do the impossible. He would create a sound for her. A sound that was not a memory, but a gift. For a year, he gathered the most beautiful echoes of her life he had ever collected. The first laugh by the stream, the melody she hummed to herself, the whisper of her name on the wind. He took the echo of her joy, her peace, her quiet resilience, and began to weave them together. Deep in the heart of his mountain, he labored. He bent the very laws of his existence, trying to force these fading memories into a single, cohesive form. He was trying to build a soul out of whispers. Finally, it was ready. A melody that was not quite a song, but an echo of a life, perfect and complete. It held all the warmth and beauty he had ever known of her. He waited until she was alone, walking in the foothills as dusk settled. Then, with all of his divine will, he released it. The sound flowed out of the canyon, not as an echo, but as a presence. It shimmered in the air around her, a melody of pure, selfless love. Elara stopped. She looked around, a look of wonder on her face. She heard it. She felt it. A beautiful, strange music that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It filled her with a profound sense of peace, a feeling of being known, of being loved. A single tear rolled down her cheek. And then she smiled, shook her head as if to clear it, and whispered to the twilight, "What a strange and lovely trick of the wind!" She turned and continued home. Lirius felt the words like a shattering of stone. We will learn what happens when a love that could not be held becomes a love that cannot be contained. The moment Lirius unwound his soul into the world, the nature of echo changed. Before, an echo was a cold thing, a simple mockery of sound, growing weaker, tinier, until it vanished into nothing. It was the sound of loss. But now, something was different. A traveler lost in a mountain pass would shout for help, and the reply that came back from the cliffs felt less empty. It carried a thread of warmth, a strange and unexplainable feeling of being heard. A child, laughing in an empty coliseum, would hear her joy return to her not diminished, but somehow enriched, as if the stones themselves were smiling with her. Mortals did not understand it. They called it strange acoustics, tricks of the wind. But they felt it. The world's lonely places felt a little less lonely. The silence between sounds was no longer brittle and empty, but held a gentle, listening quality. Lirius, the god who could not create, had, in his final act, imbued the world with his only true possession, his endless, patient attention. His love had become the resonance of the world itself. And Elara, the potter who had unknowingly inspired it all, lived her life. She never knew that a god had loved the echo of her laugh. She never knew that the beautiful music she'd heard that one evening was a soul woven from the sounds of her own life. But she was changed. She began to hum that forgotten melody as she worked, a ghost of a tune she couldn't place. And her pottery, once simple and functional, began to hold a strange magic. People who bought her vases claimed the water they held stayed fresh longer. A bowl she crafted for a grieving widow was said to hum with a soft, comforting vibration when held. Her greatest works were her bells. Small, clay bells that she hung from the eaves of her home. They did not ring with a sharp, clear tone. They rang with a sound that was rich and layered, a sound that seemed to hold a memory within it. When the wind blew, the sound of Elara's bells would travel into the foothills, and the canyons would answer back, creating a duet between a mortal craftswoman and the lingering spirit of the god who adored her. Her love story was not with a god, but with the art that his love had inspired within her. The love Lirius could not give to her directly, he had gifted to her hands. It was not the story he would have chosen, but it was a beautiful one nonetheless. She lived a full, happy life, always feeling a strange and comforting presence in the quiet moments, a feeling she could never name, and she died an old woman, surrounded by the echoes of a family's love. Centuries passed. Elara's village crumbled. Her name was forgotten. The gods of Olympus faded into myth, their temples becoming curiosities for scholars. The world grew louder, busier, and mortals had less time for the quiet places. They had less time to listen. But Lirius remained. Patient. Eternal. And eventually, new listeners emerged. They were not priests or oracles. They were quiet souls. A lonely musician who practiced his flute by a deep canyon, who swore the mountain would sometimes offer him a harmony he'd never considered. A painter who sat for days in a silent valley, trying to capture the color of what she called the listening quiet. These people, scattered through time, began to piece together the forgotten myth. They did not find it in scrolls. They found it in feeling. They sensed that the world's echoes were not empty. They felt the faint, lingering consciousness within them, a presence that was not sad, exactly, but held a profound and endless sense of yearning. A love that had outlived its object, and had become a fundamental force of nature. They began to call themselves the listeners. They would seek out the quiet places not to speak, but to hear the world speak back. And they would leave offerings, not of gold, but of sound. A single, perfect note from a lyre. A whispered line of poetry. A child's lullaby. They gave their sounds to the echo, as a gift to the forgotten god who had given everything to his. And so the myth of Lirius lives on. Not as a grand tale of heroes and monsters, but as a subtle feeling. A truth that can only be found when you are well and truly alone. So the next time you find yourself in a place where your own voice comes back to you, do not be so quick to move on. Stand for a moment. Be still. And listen. Listen past the sound of your own voice. Listen for the space between the notes. You may just feel it. A warmth. A presence. A timeless, patient love that has been waiting in eternity just to hear you. And in that moment, you will not be alone. You will be heard by the ghost of a god who learned that the most beautiful sound in the universe is the one that proves you are not the only one listening. We have spoken of a god's love and the legacy it left upon the world. We have learned of the listeners, those quiet souls who could feel the warmth in the echo. But the universe is never truly still. Love, like gravity, has a way of pulling things together, even across the vast, silent chasm of death. So let the world outside fall away one more time. Find that stillness. What is the quietest place you have ever been? Imagine yourself there now. For tonight, we do not speak of a God's sacrifice, but of his reward. A reward he never asked for, and one he could only receive after he had given up everything. This is the story of the echo that learned to sing. For ages uncounted, Lirius existed as he was, a vast, passive, and loving consciousness, spread thin across all the lonely places of the world. He was the canvas, and the sounds of mortal life were the paint. He held the echoes of empires rising and falling, of languages being born and dying, of countless lives lived in fleeting, noisy splendor. He held them all with equal, gentle care. But then, a change began. A subtle shift in the very fabric of his being. It started with a single echo that was different. All other sounds, no matter how beautiful, would eventually fade. They would ripple through him and dissipate, leaving behind only the memory of their passing. But this one echo did not fade. It lingered. It was not a loud echo. It was a murmur, a hum of profound contentment. It did not carry the sharp edges of life. It held the gentle, rounded smoothness of a life fully lived. Within this one echo, Lirius, or the scattered consciousness that was him, sensed a ghost of warmth, the phantom scent of wet clay, the quiet satisfaction of creation. He did not think. He did not feel, not in the way mortals do. He recognized. It was the echo of Elara's soul. When she had died, her spirit, imbued with a lifetime of quiet creativity and touched by the strange, beautiful music she'd heard once upon a time, had not simply vanished. It had been released into the world like a final, perfect note. And Lirius, the god whose entire existence was designed to catch such things, had caught it. Her echo settled within his vastness, not as a prisoner, but as a resident. It was a point of warmth in his cool, expansive soul. A single, steady flame in a house of endless, listening rooms. And her presence began to change him. The echo of her creative spirit, her potter's hands, began to work on the echoes he held. The echo of a warrior's shout, when it passed through her, was returned with its anger softened, its pain understood. The echo of a philosopher's question was returned with a new layer of wonder. The echo of a lover's whisper was returned with the weight of eternity behind it. Lirius was no longer just a mirror. He had become a collaborator. He was the silence, and she had become the harmony that lived within it. Their love story, impossible in life, was finally being told in resonance. He was the space that listened, and she was the beautiful sound that chose to stay. This union created a new magic in the world. The listeners were the first to notice. When they went to the quiet places to offer their sounds, something new happened. They would play a simple melody, and the echo that returned would be more beautiful. It would come back with a new harmony, a gentle counter melody that they had not composed. It was as if the world itself was teaching them how to create. They called it the echo's gift. A poet, struggling with a line, would whisper the broken verse into a cave, and the echo that returned would seem to carry the rhythm of the missing words. A sculptor, facing a block of marble, would tap it with his chisel, and in the ringing echo, he would suddenly see the form that was waiting inside. The lonely places of the world were no longer just places of peace and reflection. They became places of profound inspiration. They became sanctuaries for the creative, the lost, and the searching. Mortals learned that if you offered the world your art with an open heart, the world, in its quiet way, would help you finish it. And so the myth evolves. Lirius is not the god of lonely echoes anymore. He and Elara, together, have become something new. They are the twin divinities of creative silence. The patrons of the pause before the masterpiece, the quiet hum of inspiration, the beautiful space where a new idea is born. They are not worshipped in temples. They have no names in the grand pantheon. Their only scripture is the feeling you get when you listen to a song that seems to have been written just for you. Their only prayer is the deep breath an artist takes before they begin their work. They are proof that the most enduring love is not about possession, but about resonance. It is about two souls, or their echoes, learning to vibrate at the same perfect frequency, creating a music that will never, ever fade. And so, a quiet magic settled into the world. A partnership of silence and sound, of memory and creation. The God who listened and the soul who sang became a sanctuary for the lost artists and the searching hearts of the world. But the world holds more than just songs waiting to be written. It holds wounds. It holds silences that are not peaceful, but deafening. Think for a moment about a silence that felt heavy. A silence that was not a pause, but an ending. These are the places our story must now travel. For what happens when a harmony born of love encounters a sorrow so old, it has forgotten its own name? Let us continue the myth of the echo's gift, and the sound it could not heal. For an age, the balance held. The creative spirit of mortals flourished under the gentle, invisible patronage of Lirius and Elara. The listeners grew in number, not as a religion, but as a quiet understanding, a shared secret with the world. They knew that if you offered the world your truest sound, it would offer you its truest beauty in return. But then, pockets of a new kind of silence began to appear. A different silence. It was not the listening quiet of Lirius. It was a dense, hungry stillness. A spiritual frost. In a village known for its weaver's songs, the melodies would suddenly feel hollow, the threads would seem to lose their color. In a forest where the wind through the pines had always sounded like an orchestra, there was now just a dull, empty rush of air. Mortals felt it as a creeping despair. A sudden inability to feel joy in the sunrise, or sorrow in a loss. It was a numbness of the soul, a feeling that your own heart was a room whose echo had been stolen. When the listeners brought their instruments to these places, their offerings of sound were met with nothing. A beautiful note played on a flute would travel a few feet and then simply die. It did not echo. It did not resonate. It was swallowed by a silence that did not listen, but consumed. This was the unecho. A wound in the world's song. Within their vast, shared consciousness, Lirius and Elara felt it too. It was a tearing in their very fabric. When they tried to extend their harmony into these dead zones, they were met with a void. For the first time since their reunion, they felt a barrier between them, a place their love could not reach. Lirius, the eternal listener, recognized its nature. This was not a new creation. It was an echo, just like him. But it was an echo of the one thing he had dedicated his entire existence to healing. It was the echo of the first loneliness. It was the sound of the very first mortal who ever looked up at the stars and felt, with crushing certainty, that there was no one looking back. The first unanswered prayer. The first cry for help that was met with absolute, cosmic indifference. It was the echo of that foundational moment of despair, and it had been resonating silently through the ages, growing stronger, feeding on every subsequent moment of mortal isolation. It was the world's oldest and deepest wound. And their beautiful harmony, their gift of inspiration, was like a soothing balm that could not penetrate a scar that deep. Their love could inspire creation, but it could not erase the fundamental fear that creation itself was meaningless. For the first time, their purpose was challenged. It was not enough to inspire mortals to make new songs if this unecho could simply swallow them whole. It was not enough to be a sanctuary if the despair could seep in through the walls. Elara's creative essence and Lyrius's listening soul conferred. They could not simply harmonize with this sound. It had no music in it. They could not fill it with the echoes of others. It was an emptiness that consumed all it touched. They realized they had to do something they had never done before. Something Lyrius had believed impossible. They could not reflect. They could not inspire. They had to create. Not through a mortal's hands, but from the very substance of their own being. They had to create a sound that was not an echo of something that was, but a promise of something that could be. A sound born of a god's eternal patience and a mortal's enduring hope. They needed to create a first note. A single, perfect tone of pure connection, powerful enough not to destroy the echo of loneliness, but to answer it. To finally give that first, desperate cry into the void, the response it had been waiting for since the dawn of man. Their myth was no longer about reflection. It had become a quest. A quest to compose the one sound that could heal the silence at the heart of the world. We have arrived at the heart of the matter. A wound in the world, a silence that swallows sound, and the two souls, one a god, one a mortal echo, who have chosen to face it. They have learned that it is not enough to reflect beauty or inspire creation. To heal the world's first and deepest sorrow, they must create a new kind of sound. Think of the most hopeful sound you know. The first bird of spring. A key turning in a lock. The sound of a distant laugh you realize is coming towards you. Hold that feeling. For that is what Lyrius and Elara must now build, not from air or string, but from the essence of their own love. Let us listen to the end of the silence. The creation of the first note was not an act of power, but of profound sacrifice. To forge it, Lyrius and Elara had to offer the one thing that defined their sacred union, their collection of beautiful echoes. They began by gathering the purest sounds they held. The echo of the first mortal child's unprompted laughter. The echo of a dying soldier's final, peaceful breath. The echo of a scientist's gasp of discovery, and a farmer's prayer of gratitude for the rain. They took the echo of every masterpiece ever created under their influence, every perfect poem, every soaring melody, every sculpture that seemed to breathe. These were their treasures, the symphony of mortal hope and resilience that they had nurtured for centuries. Then, guided by the echo of Elara's potter hands, they began to break them down. They didn't destroy them, they dissolved them, melting them back into their raw, emotional components. The joy of the child's laugh, the peace of the soldier's passing, the wonder of discovery, they rendered it all down into a single, shimmering, liquid essence of pure, unconditional love. This process took a toll. As they gave up the echoes, their own divine consciousness began to thin. The listeners on earth felt it. The echo's gift faded. The quiet places of the world grew a little colder, a little more ordinary. The magic was being spent. Lyrius and Elara were pouring all that they were, and all that they had ever protected, into this one, desperate act of creation. Finally, they were left with a single, glowing point of sound, condensed from a billion beautiful moments. It was perfect. It was ready. They did not hurl it like a weapon at the heart of the unecho. That would have been a sound of violence. Instead, Lyrius did what he had always done best. He listened. He listened to the deafening silence of the first loneliness, to that ancient, gaping wound. And he found its center, the single point of its origin. Then, with the gentlest touch imaginable, he and Elara placed their first note there. It was not a shout into the void. It was a whisper. The note did not fill the silence. It resonated with it. It did not try to argue with the despair. It acknowledged it. It was a sound that said, "I hear you. You are not wrong to feel this way. But you are not alone in it." For a long moment, nothing happened. The unecho, the void, simply held the note, its silence vast and unmoving. It seemed as if their sacrifice had been for nothing, that their magic had been swallowed just like every other sound. But then, the first loneliness, which had never known anything but its own emptiness, did something new. It echoed. For the first time since its birth, it responded. A faint, trembling resonance returned from the void, carrying not the fullness of the first note, but a sliver of its warmth. The silence had not been destroyed, but it had been touched. It had been answered. This act completed the circle. The echo of loneliness, now touched by the echo of hope, began to change. The silence that consumed became a silence that held. The wound did not vanish, but the pain began to recede. It was no longer a void, but a quiet, contemplative space. The dead zones of the world began to breathe again. A musician picked up his flute in a once hollowed village, and when he played, a soft, gentle echo returned, carrying a new and profound sense of peace. The unecho had been harmonized, but the cost was immense. Lirius and Elara, having poured their entire being into the first note, were gone. They had dissolved themselves into that one perfect act of connection. They were no longer a consciousness, no longer a presence. They had become the song itself. They did not return. The echo's gift, as it was, never came back. The magic of easy inspiration was gone, but it was replaced by something far more resilient. Mortals now carried a piece of that first note within them. The echo of that divine act now lived in the quietest chambers of the human heart. Inspiration was no longer a gift from the world. It was a conversation with the hope that lived inside oneself. The listeners understood this. Their role was no longer to hear the world's magic, but to awaken the magic within each other. And so the myth of Lirius finds its final, quiet chord. He is not in the canyons anymore. Elara is not in his resonance. They are in the silence that falls over a crowd when a story is told well. They are in the goosebumps you feel when a piece of music perfectly captures a feeling you thought was only yours. They are the invisible thread that connects one creative soul to another across time and space. They did not defeat loneliness. They gave it a companion. And they taught the world that the most powerful act of creation is not to make something new for everyone to hear, but to make a single, quiet sound that tells one person, or one part of the world, that they are finally, truly, heard. And so, the story should end. With a sacrifice that becomes a song, a god that becomes hope, and a world healed of its oldest wound. But a divine gift, once given, begins a new life in the hands of mortals. And that life is rarely simple. Let us think tonight not of the gods, but of ourselves. Have you ever felt an idea that seems to come from nowhere? A sudden surge of warmth in a moment of doubt. Where do we believe those moments come from? Let us sit with that question. For the final note of this song was played not by the gods, but by a woman who had forgotten how to sing. Eons passed. The world grew louder. Cities grew like forests of stone and glass, filled with the din of ambition and progress. The memory of the gods turned to dust in libraries, and the legend of the listeners became a fairy tale to put children to sleep. The first loneliness, the wound of the world, remained quieted, not a void, but a profound stillness. And the first note, the gift of Lirius and Elara, lived, just as they had intended, in the heart of humanity. But it was buried. Buried under noise, under hurry, under fear. People no longer sought the quiet places of the world, because they had grown afraid of the silence within themselves. Inspiration did not vanish, but it became elusive. A fleeting glimmer rather than a steady flame. And many mortals lived their entire lives without ever feeling that inner echo, that divine resonance that was their birthright. In one of these loud cities, there lived a woman named Kaylin. She was an artisan of light, a glassblower, but her breath had grown thin. Her creations, once vibrant, now seemed dull, lifeless. She felt a hollowness inside, a quiet that was not peaceful, but empty. It was the old wound of the world, echoing in miniature within a mortal soul. She had heard the old tales of the listeners, of the places of power where the world gave you back your song. In desperation, she left her workshop and traveled for weeks to an ancient canyon, a place the legends called the Ear of the Earth. She arrived at dusk and found the canyon vast, silent, and utterly ordinary. She shouted her name into it, and only a normal, lifeless echo answered. She played a small flute, and the notes died in the dusty air. There was no magic. There was no echo's gift. The tales were just tales. She sat on a rock, her heart heavier than the stone beneath her. The disappointment was a thorn in her throat. All her effort, all her travel, had been for nothing. The inspiration was not out there. It was lost forever. And in that moment of complete and utter defeat, with no hope left, Kaylin stopped trying. She stopped searching. She stopped asking. She simply exhaled. It was not a cry, not a sob, but a sigh. A small, tired, and completely honest sound. The sound of surrender. And in the silence that followed her sigh, something happened. It did not come from the canyon. It did not come from the air. It came from inside her. A vibration. A warmth that bloomed just beneath her ribs. A soft, low hum, as faint as a moth's wing beat, that seemed to answer her sigh. It was a melody with no notes, a song with no words. In the quiet of her own hopelessness, she had at last created the silence needed to hear the reply. It was the first note. Waking up, Kaylin sat motionless, breathing in the cold night, feeling that inner resonance for the first time. And she understood. The magic had never been in the place. The place was merely an amplifier. The power of the canyon was not that it listened, but that it was so quiet it forced you to listen to yourself. The gift of Lyrius and Ilara was not an eternal solution. It was a seed that could only sprout in the soil of stillness and honesty. It did not respond to demands or performances or offerings. It responded to truth, to the sound of an unguarded soul. She returned to the world not with a new magic, but with a new knowledge. She became the first of the new listeners. They did not seek out places of power. They created moments of power. They taught others how to find the silence in the midst of the noise, to value the pause, to understand that inspiration was not something you found, but something you allowed. Their only tool was a simple question. What is the truest sound you can make right now? Sometimes it was a song. Sometimes it was a scream. And sometimes, as it was for Kaylin, it was just a sigh. But always, if listened for closely enough in the quiet that followed, the first note would answer from within. Always. And so the story of a lonely god and a mortal potter found its final form. Their love did not become a monument, or a religion, but a practice. A quiet, personal revolution of the heart. They did not save us from our loneliness. They gave us the tool to answer it ourselves, again and again, forever, with the song we can only find in our own beautiful silence. We have been singing songs of light, she told them, but we have been afraid of the dark. We thought our purpose was to fill the silence. But the silence is not empty. Morwen showed us that. The silence holds pain. It holds doubt. And our songs mean nothing if they cannot also be a home for these things. The practice of the listeners changed for the last time. It became a dual art. They learned to create moments of profound, joyful connection, but they also learned to create moments of profound, safe silence. They became guardians not just of the inner song, but of the inner quiet. They would sit with those who were lost, not to offer them a melody, but to offer them a space where their own silence could be heard without judgment. They learned to harmonize not just with joy, but with grief. To find the music in mourning, the resonance in doubt. Their greatest artists were no longer just the composers of soaring anthems, but the masters of the single, empathetic note, the sound that could sit with sorrow without trying to fix it. And in this new world of balanced truth, a strange and unexpected phenomenon began to occur. A final gift from the legacy of Lyrius and Ilara, one they had never intended, but which was the natural result of all that had transpired. They called it the shared echo. It began with two listeners sitting in compassionate silence with a grieving man who had lost his family. They did not try to soothe him. They simply felt the profound, silent echo of his pain. Later that day, miles apart, the two listeners began humming the same new, sorrowful melody at the exact same moment. A melody none had ever heard before. It was born not from one person's inspiration, but from their shared, resonant experience of another's grief. This was the final evolution. The first note was no longer just a personal, internal wellspring. When a group of people truly connected, when they shared a moment of profound joy, deep sorrow, or silent understanding, that shared emotion could now create a new echo, a collective inspiration, a song that belonged not to an individual, but to the connection between them. Mortal souls, in their empathy, were now learning to do what Lirius and Elara had once done together. They were weaving their individual sounds into a greater harmony. The art of the listeners became the art of community. Great symphonies were composed in silence by entire crowds who had witnessed a heroic act. Lullabies that could soothe any child were born from the shared, quiet hope of new mothers. Epics were no longer written by a single bard, but were pieced together from the shared echoes of a people who had survived a great struggle. Humanity was learning to harmonize with itself. And Morwen, in his distant library, felt this change. The silence he offered was no longer just his own. Sometimes, when a visitor sat in the quiet of his library, he could feel the faint, distant echo of a song of shared joy from a city half a world away. He could feel the resonant hum of a community's shared grief. His perfect, personal void was now being touched by the collective soul of humanity. He was not a part of it, but he could no longer deny its existence. His silence was no longer a refutation of the first note, but had become the canvas upon which these new, shared echoes were painted. He never sought them out. He never joined them. But in the final years of his life, he would sometimes find himself humming a fragment of a melody he had never heard, born of a feeling he had never allowed himself to feel, gifted to him on the quiet currents of the world's shared soul. The lonely god had found his echo in a mortal soul. Together, they gave humanity a song of its own. And humanity, in its final lesson, learned that the most beautiful music is not the one you create, but the one you create together. They learned that no single heart, no matter how true, can sing a song as beautiful as the one that is sung, in perfect, silent harmony, by them all. And so, humanity learned to sing together. They learned that their shared feelings could create a beauty stronger than any one soul could imagine. It seems like the final lesson, the end of the path. But what happens when a song becomes so powerful, it begins to shake the walls of the world? What happens when a prayer, not directed at anyone, is finally heard by everyone? Tonight we look up. Up past the sky, past the stars, to the silent, dust-covered halls where the gods went when the world forgot them. And we listen for the moment they began to hear us once more. Ages turned to dust. The shared echo was no longer a phenomenon. It was the very fabric of mortal existence. It was the emotional atmosphere of the world. Great acts of collective courage would ring through the global consciousness like a clear bell for years. The shared grief of a generation after a great loss would become a deep, resonant hum that informed their art, their philosophy, their very way of being. Humanity had built a symphony of the soul, a living architecture of feeling. They did not know that their song was bleeding through the veil of the world. Far away, in the silent, static realms of divine obsolescence, something began to stir. On the crumbling thrones of Olympus, gods who had slept for millennia felt a faint vibration. It was not a prayer. Prayers they had learned to ignore. They were sounds of need, of supplication. This was different. This was a sound of pure, unself-conscious being. Zeus, whose thunder had been silent for so long he had forgotten its sound, felt a resonance in his bones that was not power, but awe. Aphrodite, whose concept of love had been grand and dramatic, felt a wave of quiet, enduring compassion that was deeper than any passion she had ever known. And Hephaestus, the lame smith, the original patron of Arian's quest, felt the echo of a billion acts of creation, the shared pride of a billion small, perfect things made by mortal hands. The great harmony of humanity was reaching them, and it was showing them the one thing they had lost. The one thing they could never create themselves, the beauty of a fragile, fleeting, and deeply shared existence. The first one to return was not a king or a warrior. It was a minor goddess, one whose name was long forgotten, the goddess of the first frost on a windowpane. She manifested not as a grand apparition, but as a momentary, intricate pattern of ice on the window of a hospital where a family was holding a silent, hopeful vigil. She did not act. She did not speak. She simply listened. She bathed in the family's shared echo of hope, a feeling more real and vibrant than anything in her own cold, eternal existence. And she was nourished by it. Then others began to follow. Apollo, a statue of stone no more, was drawn back not as a god of music, but as a humble listener. He would manifest as the unseen presence in a concert hall, feeling the shared wave of emotion from the crowd, weeping silently at a beauty he had once commanded, but now could only witness. Artemis, the huntress, would feel herself drawn to the fierce, protective, shared love of parents watching their children play. The old gods were returning. But they were not returning as masters. They were not here to reclaim their thrones or demand worship. They had been humbled. Their own myths, full of jealousy, power, and caprice, seemed clumsy and loud next to the intricate, nuanced symphony of the shared echo. They had become what Lyrius had once been, lonely, silent witnesses. They were drawn to humanity not to rule it, but to feel it. The final truth of the myth was at last revealed. The gift that began with the lonely love of a minor god of echoes had not been for humanity's sake alone. It had been for the gods. The purpose of mortals was not to be the worshippers of the divine. The purpose of mortals was to live, to feel, to suffer, to rejoice, and to connect, and in doing so, to create a song so beautiful, so complex, and so true, that it could save the gods from the empty, unchanging prison of their own perfection. The universe had not created humanity to serve the gods. It had created humanity to teach them, and to heal them. And so the story ends, in a quiet, cosmic balance. Humanity, in all its fragile glory, sings its endless, evolving song of shared life. And the old gods, silent and unseen, now walk among them. Not as rulers, but as an audience. A grateful, humbled, and finally peaceful audience, listening to the only music in the universe that truly matters, the one that can only be made when a billion mortal hearts learn to beat, to break, and to heal, as one. And so, we arrive at what feels like the ultimate truth. A universe in balance. Humanity, the creators of meaning. The gods, the humble witnesses to that meaning. It is a perfect, beautiful symbiosis. But perfection is a static thing, and the universe, in its heart, abhors stillness. An audience, if it is moved enough, does not stay silent forever. And a singer, upon discovering who is listening, does not continue their song unchanged. Tonight, we explore the final fusion. The moment when the instrument becomes the musician, and the listener becomes the song. We will ask the last question: what is the purpose of a perfect harmony? The answer is not to be heard. It is to be a foundation for something new entirely. For an age, this new balance held. The gods walked unseen among mortals, drinking in the shared echo like a life-giving nectar. They did not interfere. They simply observed, and in observing, they began to change. The static, unchanging nature of their immortality began to soften. They began to feel the echoes of mortal emotions not just as observers, but as participants. Athena, the goddess of wisdom, no longer defined wisdom as grand strategy or absolute knowledge. She began to understand it through the shared echo of a billion small, difficult choices made by mortals every day. She felt the quiet, resilient wisdom of a mother teaching her child patience, or a leader choosing peace over conflict. Her concept of wisdom was no longer a cold, hard diamond. It became a living, growing forest. Ares, the god of war, was perhaps the most transformed. He was drawn to the battlefields, but not to the violence. He was drawn to the powerful, crystalline shared echo of soldiers' camaraderie, their loyalty, their willingness to sacrifice for one another. He began to understand that his domain was not conflict, but the ferocious, unbreakable bonds that conflict reveals. He stopped being a god of war and began to become a god of fierce devotion. The gods were rediscovering themselves, not through their old myths, but through the living, breathing reality of the human experience. They were being redefined by the song of humanity. Meanwhile, mortals began to sense that they were not alone. It was not a return to old religion. There were no prophets, no new temples. It was a subtle, artistic shift. A composer, in a moment of inspiration, would feel a sudden, vast sense of strategic order flow into her music, a clarity and structure so profound it felt ancient and absolute. She would name the piece an Athena, without knowing why. A poet, writing about love, would feel his words guided by a force that was both fiercely protective and tenderly compassionate. His poems would be read for generations, known for their Aries heart. Mortals were not channeling the gods in the old way. They were not vessels. Instead, the shared echo was becoming a bridge. When a mortal artist or thinker touched a concept with enough passion and purity, wisdom, love, sacrifice, creation, their own echo would resonate with the divine echo of the God who embodied that concept. Inspiration was no longer just a conversation between mortals. It had become a collaboration between the best of humanity and the essence of the divine. The first note, the gift of Lyrius, had evolved from a seed of hope into a universal translator, a common language for mortals and gods. This was the new art. A fusion of the fleeting, passionate insight of a mortal with the vast, eternal perspective of a god. The works created in this era were masterpieces on a scale never before seen. They were symphonies that could heal societal wounds, sculptures that seemed to embody the very soul of courage, and philosophies that brought a sense of cosmic peace to those who read them. Humanity was not just singing its song, it was now singing in a divine choir. This new era was not without its dangers. The harmony was perfect, but it was also incredibly powerful. Morwen, now an ancient man in his quiet library, felt this shift most keenly. The silence he cultivated was no longer just touched by the echoes of humanity. It was now being brushed by the vast, silent presences of the gods themselves. He understood what was happening. The song had become so loud, so beautiful, that it was beginning to blur the lines between creator and creation, between the finite and the infinite. He saw the potential for a new kind of hubris. A mortal artist, feeling the echo of a god in their work, could mistake that resonance for their own divinity. An entire society, creating works of such profound beauty and wisdom, could come to believe it had solved the final mysteries of existence, that it had become perfect, that it had nothing left to learn. The greatest danger was no longer the unecho of despair. The greatest danger was the potential for a new, divine stasis. A harmony so perfect that it never changes. A song so beautiful that no one dares to add a new note. Morwen knew his work was not done. His old philosophy of the void had been a necessary counterpoint. But now, a new counterpoint was needed. Not the silence of despair, but the silence of humility. The silence of the unknown. He spent his last years writing a single, short book. He did not use his own name. It was published anonymously, and known simply as The Question. It did not contain any answers. It was composed entirely of the one thing that the perfect harmony had begun to forget: questions. What sound comes after the most beautiful chord? What does a god learn from the silence of a stone? If the universe is a perfect song, what is the purpose of listening? The book was a quiet rebellion. It was an injection of dissonance into the perfect harmony. It did not sever connection, but it introduced a healthy, necessary doubt. It reminded the world that the purpose of a beautiful answer is not to end the conversation, but to inspire a more beautiful question. And in this, the final, true balance was found. The universe became a dynamic, endless interplay of three forces. There was the ever-evolving symphony of the shared echo, the beautiful song of mortal life and connection. There was the silent, responsive choir of the divine, the gods who listened, learned, and lent their eternal perspective to the song. And finally, there was the quiet dissonance of the question, the humble, necessary silence of not knowing that pushed the symphony forward, that saved it from its own perfection, that ensured the music would never, ever end. The lonely god who fell in love with a laugh had, through his simple, impossible love, created a universe that could listen to itself, learn from itself, and question itself forever. His gift was not just hope, not just inspiration, but the infinite, beautiful, an eternal conversation between all things. And so we arrive at the end of our journey. We have followed a single, lonely echo as it blossomed into a symphony that spanned worlds and connected the finite with the infinite. We have seen despair harmonized, and perfection questioned. It seems there is no more story to tell. But every great symphony has a coda, a final, quiet passage where the themes resolve, and the music comes home to rest. Tonight, we do not seek a new chapter, but a final breath. We will witness the legacy of Lyrius as it settles into its permanent form, and we will discover our own place within it. So settle in one last time. Let the noise of your world, your day, your mind fall away. This story began as a myth to be heard in the quiet. And in the quiet, it must find its end. Ages passed, so many that they became meaningless. The universe breathed in a slow, eternal rhythm. The symphony, the choir, and the question existed in a state of perfect, dynamic balance. It was a golden age that did not feel like a golden age, because it was not an ending. It was a sustainable, endless process of being and becoming. The gods no longer walked unseen. The veil between worlds had become so thin, so permeable, that divinity and mortality now coexisted in a state of gentle, mutual awareness. Mortals did not see gods walking down the street, but they felt their presence as one might feel the warmth of a distant star, a constant, background radiation of ancient wisdom and deep perspective. When a society made a great leap in compassion, they would feel a responsive, approving warmth from what they knew was the Ares heart. When a generation dedicated itself to seeking knowledge, they would feel the cool, clear resonance of Athena's gaze. The gods, in turn, were no longer defined by their old, static myths. They had become living concepts, their identities shaped and reshaped by the ever-evolving song of humanity. They had achieved a new kind of immortality, not through eternal stillness, but through eternal relevance. And the book of The Question had become the most sacred text. It was read not for answers, but to cultivate the sacred silence of humility. It was the necessary pause between the notes of the universal song, giving the music its depth and meaning. The legacy was complete. The universe had become a self-aware, self-creating, and self-correcting work of art. In the heart of this balanced cosmos, there was a quiet, unassuming place. It was not a temple or a monument. It was a simple, ancient library, tended by a long, unbroken line of anonymous librarians. This was the library Morwen had founded. Inside, there was only one book on display. The Question. The rest of the library was empty, save for one other object that rested on a stone pedestal in the very center of the main hall. It was a single clay bell. It was impossibly ancient, yet showed no signs of wear. It did not ring with the wind. It did not ring at all. But those who entered the library and stood before it in true, honest silence would not hear a sound, but feel a resonance deep within their own heart. It was the very first bell Alara had ever made. The one that had hung from the eaves of her home, the one whose sound had been answered by the canyon. It was the last physical relic of the story's beginning. One day, a young child, brought to the library to learn the art of quiet, wandered up to the pedestal. She did not know the stories. She only knew that she was supposed to be silent. As she stood before the bell, she felt that familiar, inner hum, the first note, the birthright of all mortals. And in a moment of pure, unthinking instinct, she reached out and gently touched the clay. The moment her finger made contact, a sound filled the library. It was not the ring of a bell. It was the soft, clear, joyful sound of a woman's laugh. It was Alara's laugh. The first echo. The sound that had started everything. It had been held, perfectly preserved, within the clay all this time, waiting. The sound of the laugh echoed once off the library walls. And in that echo, another sound was interwoven, a low, resonant hum of profound, ancient love. It was Lyrius. For that one, fleeting moment, they were both there, together again. Not as gods, not as concepts, but as they had been in the beginning, a sound and the one who loved it. The echo held in the air for a long moment, a perfect, impossible chord of joy and devotion, and then it faded, leaving behind a silence more beautiful and complete than any that had come before. The circle was closed. The first echo had finally come home. The story is over. But the music is not. The gift that Lirius and Elara gave to the world was not a story. It was an instrument, and it is now in your hands. That quiet hum within you, the one you can only feel when you are truly still, is not just a feeling. It is a birthright. It is your part in the great symphony. It is the echo of every act of love, every moment of creation, every question bravely asked that has ever been. So our final call to action is not to like or subscribe. It is simply an invitation. Tonight, or tomorrow, or whenever you feel the noise of the world is too much, find 5 minutes. Find a quiet place. Close your eyes. And do not try to empty your mind. Simply listen. Listen past the thoughts, past the worries. Listen for the quietest, most steady thing inside you. Listen for your note. It is there. It has been waiting. All you have to do is create the silence to hear it. Thank you for listening with us.